What if I told you the most famous artists, writers, and inventors actually thought creativity was overrated? That's what I learned from reading The Daily Rituals by Mason Currey. This book describes how over 160 famous creators lived. And while plenty of them were weird, I discovered that none of them waited for creativity to strike in order to do great work. So what did they do? Well, I want to share with you what I learned studying the most creative minds of all time and why they actually thought creativity was overrated. Then we're going to explore the science of creativity to see if they were right. And finally, we'll turn our findings into a simple system that anyone can use to do great work, even if you feel like you're not creative. So what do all these successful artists, writers, and inventors value more than creativity? Well, to answer that, we need to know how they spent their time, because how you spend your time is a reflection of your values. So let me tell you the story of how Vincent Van Gogh, a 28-year-old store clerk who had never painted seriously, became one of the most respected artists of all time. You see, Van Gogh had a normal childhood. He wasn't born wealthy or with artistic talents, and he didn't receive any formal training until he was already an adult. But when he was 28, after working odd jobs for over 12 years, his brother encouraged him to pursue art. Vincent agreed, and despite not having any formal training, moved back home and began the grueling process of teaching himself to draw and paint from scratch. After months of working from sunrise to well past sunset, he started to improve slowly as an artist. For the rest of his life, he drew and painted fanatically. Often when we think of Van Gogh, we think of him as the epitome of the tortured artist. And he did suffer from depression for all his life, but in spite of his depression and late start in life, and even the feeling that he was not talented, he wrote to his brother to say, "In spite of everything, I shall rise again and take up my pencil and draw and draw." The same was true about the famous author Ernest Hemingway. He said, "I love to write, but it has never gotten easier to do." All his life, Ernest felt like he was constantly struggling to put words onto the page. And when words did come to him, they came out in a jumbled mess. Yet now we know him as one of the most concise writers of all time. So how did he turn his first drafts into masterpieces? He did two things. First, he had a strong writing routine. He started working at 6 in the morning, and he didn't stop until he hit a high point of interest in his stories, which was usually around noon. For those 6 hours, he was completely content to only write 300 words, which is less than 1 word per minute. The second thing he did was constantly analyze his own work and rewrite it. He wrote, "The next morning when you've had a good sleep and you're feeling fresh, rewrite what you wrote the day before." So it wasn't random bursts of inspiration or creativity that helped Hemingway write, but what he called a good and severe discipline. And that's what I really discovered about almost all of the artists, writers, and inventors in this book. Truly great thinkers like Tesla or Van Gogh didn't leave the creative act up to chance. They were going to work even if it didn't produce anything, and maybe especially if they weren't feeling creative. But maybe these people really were gifted, and their advice wouldn't work for a person like me. So next, I studied the science of creativity, and what I found genuinely shocked me. The first thing I learned is that creativity is really hard to measure. In the late 1800s, psychologist Francis Galton studied, quote, "men of genius" to see if there were really any traits they all shared. But his conclusions were unhelpful. He described certain people as talented or gifted and others as uncreative. But other scientists were unsatisfied with this answer. After all, the people with the most output often described themselves as not gifted or talented. It wasn't until 1954 when J.P. Gilliford published a paper titled "A Factorial Analytic Study of Creative Thinking Abilities" that psychologists began to devise tests to measure creativity. Here's what he did. He asked 410 air cadets to imagine the different uses for a brick. You could use it to build a house or smash a window. You could use it as a doorstop and 100 other things. The more uses they listed, the higher their level of divergent production, which is a scientific term for creativity. So for the first time, we had a way of measuring how creative someone was. And you still see this test today. I actually went to a seminar where the speaker gave us that exact test. But even though that test is very popular, it's not widely accepted in the scientific community. Because while Gilliford moved us away from thinking of people as gifted or not gifted, he couldn't explain why people were more creative than others. So what does the modern science have to say about creative output? Well, to demonstrate our best findings, I want to share with you a story. Imagine a kindergartner who can't read or write. Now for homework, they're assigned a 10-page paper on the complete works of Shakespeare. It doesn't matter how creative they are, they're gonna fail that assignment. So creativity here has no relation to quality output. Before they can write that paper, they need to be read to. Then they need to be taught how to read and write. Then they need to be given feedback so they know where to improve. And finally, after years of practice, then they can write that paper. Now the takeaway here is that we are all kindergartners at something. And this story demonstrates the 3 things modern science knows about producing great work. So to show you these principles, let's say I'm trying to learn piano. But this could be any creative skill. It could be graphic design, writing, painting, or even chess. If I've never played before, I'm gonna sound terrible. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd probably give myself a 0. But before I start improving, I need to know what a great piano player sounds like so I can set a goal for myself. In other words, our potential is largely determined by our exposure to great work. So let's check out the science. There was a paper titled The Unique Contribution of Home Literacy Environment to Differences in Early Literacy Skills. And that paper, and dozens of others like it, basically said that kids who were surrounded by books in the home, read too often, and were given encouragement to read were better readers. This isn't super surprising, but what did surprise me is that the same is true for basically all creative output. What that means is if you want to learn an art, studying great artists raises the bar for what's possible. In other words, the first step to doing great work is to get inspired. Now, there are two kinds of inspiration, and they're both equally important. What we covered so far was external inspiration, which is learning what's possible. But internal inspiration is learning that great work is doable. This is often called a growth mindset. And a survey of more than 600,000 students published by the Program for International Student Assessment found that students with a growth mindset outperformed their fixed mindset peers in reading, science, and math. And it turns out that students who changed from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset also improved in those subjects. So it's not just that some students were smarter and therefore inspired to do better, but being inspired to do better made them smarter. What's really interesting is that inspiration is not something that happens to you, but something that you actively seek out. Van Gogh, for example, would spend months sitting outside sketching the night sky before he ever painted Starry Night. So if our goal is to learn the piano, say from a self-described 0 to a 10, our first step is to get inspiration so we have a clear understanding of what a 10 really is. But inspiration is obviously not enough. If we spent all day analyzing piano pieces, we'd be music critics, not musicians. So if inspiration raises the bar for what's possible, our next step is to raise the floor on our ability. In other words, we want our worst performance to be a 3, not a 0. So how do we do that? Well, Ultralearning by Scott Jung sets out to answer this exact question. It's a book about rapid skill acquisition, and it describes how you can improve at any creative activity. So let's go back to the piano and use some Ultralearning techniques to improve my play. Right now I don't know anything, so my first step is to learn some piano basics. I might find out what a scale is, what a chord is, and where middle C is. Next, I want to learn all the basic procedural information about a piano. So that's how to play a scale, how to play a chord, how to bring my fingers back to middle C. These two types of knowledge build on each other. Knowing what the scales are makes practicing them easier. And when I practice my scales, it makes learning new piano pieces easier. That's because all knowledge accrues compound interest. Understanding one thing like a note makes understanding a scale easier. Scott also points out that there are different levels of knowledge. The most basic kind of knowledge is something that's learnable. That means you can read about it or study it. The next level of knowledge is teachable. You can really only get this with a mentor, which is why getting feedback from experienced people in your field is so powerful. And finally, the most rare kind of knowledge is only just knowable. That means you can't read it anywhere, you can't be taught it by anyone, you can only experience it for yourself. You can read about how hard a marathon is, a coach can try to prepare you, but you'll only know how hard it is once you're actually doing it. So this brings us to our third lesson on creative output. We've raised the bar on what's possible, we've raised the floor on our ability. How do we tighten the range so that we're consistently doing great work? Well, Jerry Uelsman at the University of Florida had the same question. He wanted to see if inspiration and education were enough to be a great photographer. So he devised an experiment with his photography students. Half the students would be graded by a single photo they presented at the end of the semester. This was the quality group. The other half were graded by how many photos they took. This was the quantity group. But what surprised him the most was that all the best photos were taken by the quantity group. How did that happen? To understand that, we have to learn how people improve at things. So to learn that, let's take a look at an article called How to Do Great Work, written by Paul Graham. Now, Paul Graham has been at the forefront of creative innovation for over 20 years. He's helped build companies like Airbnb, Stripe, and Coinbase, just to name a few. And in the article, Paul discusses something really interesting, that creative fields seem to have cracks in them. From far away, the boundaries about what we know and what we don't know seem well defined. But as we get closer to the truth, we see a lot of missing pieces. Connecting those missing pieces is where great work is done. And because most of those missing pieces are only discovered when we're working, it's impossible to take an amazing photo your first time. You have to fail a lot, because failure is the recognition that there are missing pieces in your knowledge and your skill set. So how do we fill those gaps and improve our creative output? That's exactly what Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole asked in their book Peak when they set out to study the science of expertise. And what they found was the defining difference between an amateur and an expert was the way they practiced. So let's go back to the piano to learn how an amateur versus an expert improves at their craft. Right now I'm an amateur and I can really only play a few songs. Ericsson and Poole call this acceptable performance, and it's the reason most amateurs don't improve. You see, I'm comfortable playing the songs that I know, so when I sit down at the piano to practice, I'm really just going to play those songs on repeat. I don't improve because I've made practice automatic. I'm not being challenged at all. So how should we practice if we want to become experts? Ericsson and Poole give us 4 science-backed rules for deliberate practice. 1. Deliberate practice is always hard. If I know how to play a song already, I'm not learning. And if I'm not learning, I'm not improving. 2. Deliberate practice is intentional. My goal when I sit down at the piano to practice is to learn something specific, like a new song or chord progression. This is the only way to avoid automatically practicing what you already know. 3. Deliberate practice requires complete focus. My piano teacher used to tell me that 5 minutes of deliberate practice was better than an hour of playing piano while watching TV. She was right. Modern neuroscience knows that our brains are bad at multitasking, especially when it comes to learning. So removing distractions from your environment is key to improving. 4. Deliberate practice requires immediate feedback. Often feedback comes weeks or even years after our practice has paid off. When we sell our first website, when we get that design job, or when our book finally gets published. But our rate of improvement is really determined by how fast we can get feedback. That's because our brains care more about what happens now than what might happen in the future. Neuroscientists call this hyperbolic discounting, and it's the same reason we might sleep in instead of work out, because comfort now matters more than health in the future. So we want to get feedback as quickly as possible. Now sometimes it's easy. When I play a wrong note on the piano, I can hear it. But it's harder to know if a piece of music I wrote is good or not. That's why mentorship is so important. A mentor can tell you if your work is good or bad, and they can tell you why it's good or bad. But if you don't have access to a good teacher, publishing your work before you think it's ready can also be a really powerful way to improve. So if you want to get better faster, get feedback. But theory will only take you so far. So how can we combine the habits of world-class artists with the neuroscience we learn to consistently do great work? That's exactly what Cal Newport asks in his book, Deep Work. Cal is a professor at Georgetown, and his book breaks down the science behind doing great work. In the book, Cal actually argues there are 5 steps that anyone can follow to produce great work and actually enjoy the process. The 5 steps are explained in a conversation between himself and architecture professor David Duane. As an architect, David wants to map Cal's theories onto a building. The goal of the building, David explained, is to create a setting where the users can get into a state of deep human flourishing, creating work that's at the absolute extent of their personal abilities. The idea is that the best work is produced by going deep on a subject, and if we understand what the ideal environment for deep work looks like, we can model aspects of it in our own lives. So we start sketching it out. The first room is a large gallery of creative works that were made in the building. Artists would hang paintings, writers would have bookshelves, and musicians would have records. So the first step is to spend time at the beginning of each day studying great work. We know from our neuroscience section that inspiration is important, so this is a fantastic way to incorporate it into your daily routine. As we walk through the gallery, the next room we're greeted with is a coffee shop. There's a place to get some drinks, some couches to sit down and talk, and Wi-Fi to do some light work. The idea here is to create a space of collaboration and community. Writers like Carl Jung and composers like Mozart would often go to coffee shops to collaborate with people and sketch out ideas. So the next step is to join a community where you can bounce ideas back and forth with other people. We know from neuroscience that feedback is important, so this can be one of the most powerful ways to grow as a creator. So we talk with some friends, we've got some ideas, so we decide to leave the coffee shop and enter into the next room. This next room almost feels like a separate building because it's an enormous library. It has everything you need to do research for your project. If you're painting, it has books on the techniques of great painters. If you're writing, it has the advice of great writers. This room represents education and quiet reflection. This is where we explore the ideas we had when talking with other people. So the next step is to use the internet to research areas you'd like to improve. So we've done our research, solidified our ideas, now it's time to leave the library and enter into the next room. This room is a lot brighter, there's lots of plants, and you can feel a special kind of energy here. That's because this room is a beautiful office designed for getting all of your shallow work done as quickly as possible. This is the room where you declutter your mind. You answer emails, you take calls, and you do all of the administrative stuff you need to do before you can do deep work. So the next step is to get all the shallow work out of the way so your mind is totally free to solve hard problems. Finally, we leave the office and enter into the final room. This final room is completely empty except for what you need to work and is completely soundproof. This room represents deep work, and the idea is you work for 90 minutes with total focus before you take a break. So the final step to doing great work is to spend long periods of time with complete focus on a difficult problem. So what would a practical routine look like for you? Well, here's what my day looks like when designing websites. First, I spend a couple minutes looking at websites that inspire me, and I take notes on what I like and don't like. Then I reach out to some design friends to get feedback on my work so far. I do this a couple of times throughout the design process. If I get some good feedback, I'll spend some time researching how to implement that. And then I'll do some administrative work like answering emails or talking with a client. Once my head is clear, I'll start designing, and I try to work uninterrupted for as long as I possibly can. If I can work offline, I do, and I always try to design on on paper before I move to the computer. Now this routine works for me, but you don't have to follow these steps in order. In fact, Cal Newport lays out 4 methods for implementing deep work into your life that dozens of successful creatives have used. The first method is modeled after the life of Van Gogh. Van Gogh spent most of his adult life alone and worked almost every hour of the day. When he wasn't working, he was studying other great artists, writing letters, and getting inspiration from the local nightlife. In other words, he spent nearly his entire life in a state of deep work. This is called the monastic model, and it's the most extreme method on this list. Instead of trying to fit deep work around a busy schedule, you remove the busy schedule completely. But constant isolation is terrifying, even to the most fanatic artists. That's where the second method comes in, modeled after Carl Jung, one of the most famous psychologists of all time. Jung had a thriving clinical practice that kept him busy until late at night. He had meetings with intellectuals like Einstein, and he gave lectures at many of the universities in Zurich. His life, like ours, was busy. So how did he find time to write dozens of books and papers that would radically change our understanding of psychoanalysis? Well, for a few months out of the year, he lived in a stone house that was completely without modern amenities. He woke up at 7 a.m. every morning, wrote for a few hours, and then took long walks in nature. This is the bimodal method. You spend time getting ideas, building community, and doing research before retreating to synthesize that into great work. When Bill Gates was the CEO of Microsoft, he lived in a cabin in the woods for 2 weeks a year to work on big ideas. This method is great for established artists, but it's nearly impossible if you don't control your own schedule. So this third method is built with that in mind, and it's modeled after Time magazine editor Walter Isaacson. As a journalist, he has an incredibly hectic schedule. Tight deadlines, lots of travel, interviews, editing, chasing down witnesses, all eat up your time. So how did he find time to also write award-winning biographies of Steve Jobs, Einstein, Elon Musk, Benjamin Franklin, and other famous figures? Well, as luck would have it, Cal Newport's uncle actually lived with him and some friends at a summer vacation rental, and this is how he described Isaacson. He would retreat up to the bedroom for a while when the rest of us were chilling on the patio or whatever to work on his book. He'd go up for 20 minutes or an hour, we'd hear the typewriter pounding, then he'd come down as relaxed as the rest of us. The work never seemed to faze him. He just happily went up to work when he had the spare time. This is the journalistic method because it models how journalists have to fit writing in wherever they can. But this doesn't come easy to most people. You might try to work for a few minutes here and there, and find that you're not making much progress at all. That's why this fourth method was designed to work for almost everyone. It doesn't involve months of complete isolation, and it doesn't require you to snap into work mode at a moment's notice. It's modeled after how Jerry Seinfeld wrote jokes for TV and stand-up. Every day he'd dedicate time to uninterrupted blocks of writing. He said that the success of the Seinfeld show was because him and Larry David would just lock themselves in a room and write. Now this wasn't for months at a time like Carl Jung, sometimes it was only for a few hours. But he said those hours of concentrated work were so much more valuable than waiting for inspiration. This is called the rhythmic method, where you work with total focus for around 90 minutes and then you take a break. You repeat this as often as your schedule and willpower will let you, and then you do other things like answer emails, do research, or talk with other creatives. This is the most approachable way to practice deep work, and it also aligns with the neuroscience we talked about earlier. But however you choose to work, the most important thing to understand is that no great art is made by chance. So I'll leave you with a quote by Pablo Picasso. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working.